Hello, folks. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present with you all. Thanks for being here. My name is Aria McLauchlan, and I am our co-founder and executive director of LANCOR. So LANCOR is a 501c3 organization with a mission to advance soil health policies and programs that create value for farmers, businesses, and communities. And we really think about our work in terms of building the missing infrastructure and market-based incentives that will make the rapid adoption and scalability of soil health possible, particularly across the United States. Our work and programs fall across four main areas. We're going to focus primarily on policy and risk mitigation, of course, today. Now, I want to share a little bit about our approach to all of these different areas of work so that you might consider drawing from it in your own work if it's useful. We deliberately use the term soil health rather than regenerative agriculture, for example, or just other terms, even though we're often talking about the same thing, because it can be a big tent, something that is inclusive and non-controversial. And so we found that soil health works in both very liberal and very conservative agricultural communities. We take great care on that note to be nonpartisan, and so sometimes we find that it's more effective to leave the benefits of reversing climate change aside and focus more on the farmer, on the economic benefits to the farmer through soil health practices. We explicitly talk about not being an environmental organization, and we're really supportive of all production types. You might hear me use the term farmer throughout this presentation, but we really mean producer to include farmers and ranchers and all kinds of ag production. One of our values and sort of ethoses as an organization is to use existing infrastructure and not reinvent the wheel, as well as in policy to not ask for mandatory standards or new regulations or big government expansion. And ultimately, we're looking to drive economic incentives rather than increased dependence on government subsidies. Now, policy is powerful, and we believe we should make a public infrastructure work for us, whether it's a political representative, which is very relevant right now, a policy, or a public program. Getting involved is crucial, and this is especially true of agriculture. Our policy, our government policy, informs what we grow, how we grow it, how we innovate, what kind of risks we take and recognize. And the subsidies from agriculture, as many of you know, are really vast in their spread. It includes everything from crop insurance, conservation programs, marketing loans, disaster aid, and research, as well as the setting or almost guaranteeing of both prices, market prices and revenue for commodities. So there's just a huge amount of subsidization in agriculture, and we really ultimately believe that if you intend on changing agriculture and supporting agriculture, that one does need to be involved in policy in some way. Now, our main piece of food and agricultural legislation in the United States is informally called the Farm Bill. It's passed every 5 years, so our next Farm Bill will pass in the year of 2023. So about this time next year, we'll be in full swing preparing for it and submitting our priorities, and those go to the Agriculture Committee. So that's the committee in Congress that has oversight for this large piece of legislation. And it's an omnibus bill. It has around 12 titles or sections, including commodities and trade. A big one is nutrition, which covers food stamps, or the SNAP program, as you might know it. And that really brings together both our urban and rural constituents under one major bill. So it affects really every citizen in the United States. And then, of course, there's the conservation title, which, if you have an interest in soil health, is often where you're sent. It's a big area of focus for this topic. The Farm Bill passes every 5 years. What that also means is that the Ag Committee is generally a little reluctant to pass legislation outside of that 5-year window. Now, what that means for us is that we've started to think about other ways, other opportunities, other committees where we might be able to include soil health policy. So, for example, tax changes could happen via the Ways and Means Committee. There's also infrastructure or stimulus bills, and we'll be looking ahead to those. Now, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, and we really think that what happens in government agencies is as important as new legislation, and getting involved in the implementation of a policy or program can be as important as new legislation. And I would also strongly encourage anyone interested in promoting a new idea for legislation to do their homework and learn about the existing programs, research, funding, and technical support available at USDA. There really is quite a lot there. Okay, now our conservation programs really are kind of the bread and butter of conservation policy. I thought I would share that the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the agency that oversees a lot of these, was established by FDR in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl, and this agency was originally named the Soil Conservation Society. So LANCOR recognizes it as a really crucial piece of existing infrastructure. For a quote-unquote small agency, there are around 10,000 employees there with a presence in almost every county in the country. So there's a lot that can be done. And there are some pretty well-known and loved conservation programs, including some of the ones you can see on the screen here. The Conservation Innovation Grants is quite close to, it has a special place in our heart because it's the home of the on-farm innovation trials and the soil health demonstration trials. These are new programs that passed in the 2018 Farm Bill. Landcore built a broad coalition of support for the soil health demonstration trials in particular, and we really showed up during the implementation phase of this legislation to ensure we worked on a number of priorities, but particularly ensuring that soil health verification protocols would be in place. And we're really proud of this work because we ostensibly have our first national program that funds projects that apply innovative techniques and measures the results in terms of increased carbon sequestration and other soil health measures. I think that this program is really a great indication of how far this movement has come, and there are policies to increase the funding and presence of this program in the future. Now, these conservation programs are far from perfect, and I am guessing that Meredith will likely talk about some of the barriers to accessing the support and technical assistance and funding, but it is a strong baseline. Now, these are some specific bills that I'd like to share with you. You're welcome to take screenshots. It's by no means exhaustive, but these are some of the bills that have been introduced into Congress. And we'll start with conservation bills that are here to strengthen conservation programs and resilient agriculture more broadly. And Senator Cory Booker's bill has very clear, strong language that would increase the funding and presence of these conservation programs. So if you're looking to see what that kind of language would look like, that's a really strong example. Representative Shelley Pingree of Maine's Agricultural Resilience Act also increases funding for conservation programs, and there are 5 sections of that bill that more broadly support agricultural research, soil health, farmland preservation and vitality through marketing programs that give farmers access to spread their wares, and then recognizing the climate mitigating role of pasture-based livestock is a big section of their bill, and on-farm renewable energy. Okay, additionally, we have some infrastructure bills. These are pretty straightforward, non-controversial bills. They frankly probably should have been in place some time ago, but we're pleased that they are at least here now. The Farmer-Driven Conservation Outcomes Act of 2020 is around facilitating data sharing. The Cover Crop Flexibility Act of 2020 focuses on allowing for practices such as grazing of cover crops to be allowed while remaining eligible for crop insurance. And then the Compost Act would recognize compost as a standard conservation practice. And this is promising. It's basic, but it's promising because it would send a signal to producers and municipalities to invest in compost infrastructure and let producers know that there's a source of funding for this practice. Okay, and then finally, some innovative incentives. There is what we're calling the 45T carbon sequestration tax credit on working lands, or a credit for producers, both farmers, ranchers, and foresters who are sequestering carbon on working lands specifically. This is currently in its most fleshed out form via a discussion draft from Senator Bennett of Colorado's office, and folks are really looking at that as an interesting way to provide an additional and new incentive for these producers. Even more recently, Representative Spanberger introduced the Healthy Soil Resilient Farmer Act of 2020, and that would be to establish loans that are overseen by the FSA to support producers, both livestock and crops, in improving their soil health, and that's something we really like to see. I think overall we want to push for new loans that recognize soil health, that recognize risk mitigation out of the FSA in general. And then finally, a bill that has quite a bit of fanfare and support is the Growing Climate Solution Act. It's a bipartisan bill from Senators Braun and Stabenow, who is the head of or the ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, as well as Senators Graham and Whitehouse. Now, this has some controversy, I think, depending on where you net out on the efficacy of carbon markets, especially for smaller farmers, but it is really a sign of the interest in soil health from companies as a way to meet their sustainability targets, and for producers who are interested in additional forms of support for applying these soil health practices on their land. I'm happy to answer more questions about that later down the line. Now, there's also this key initiative from LANCOR that I want to talk a little bit about. We tend to focus on specific and essential pieces of infrastructure and incentives that will help regenerative ag and soil health practices to be widely and swiftly adopted in the US, and as a criteria for us that have a likely chance of moving forward in the next 1 to 2 years. And this is in contrast to policies that perhaps propose more sweeping reform. But we have identified, and what we continue to see over a period of a number of years, is that for any new economic incentive that pays producers based on a conservation outcome, that requires clear outcomes verification protocols. So, for example, whether it's a carbon market or a tax incentive, as I just mentioned, or even outcomes-based supply chain integration with companies, these will only function if we can measure and verify that result. And so LANCOR has proposed at a number of occasions an outcomes verified soil health program that could be overseen at USDA that would create a common baseline for soil health indicators, for sampling protocol, and for lab calibration procedures that would allow for us to have just an apples-to-apples conversation. And we think that this is really important to facilitate not only new federal policies, but also state-level policies that continue to be created, as well as private sector initiatives that are looking to support this kind of work. Particularly from the farmer's perspective, we really don't want a situation in which a farmer has to take a new soil health test for every subsidy and every market-based program and every supply chain initiative. Having some consistency will really help to reduce some of that bureaucracy and paperwork that can so often be a concern for producers. Now, here I'll offer up as a resource practical, nonpartisan policy recommendations. And for folks who are looking for ideas, I welcome and encourage you to check those out. Now, I've talked a little bit about LANCOR's framing as not an environmental organization, or not really attached to the climate change bandwagon, but to think increasingly about risk mitigation. This is not only a strong framing for policy messaging, but a huge opportunity and area of work. And so I'm going to share a little bit about that with you now to finish this up. LANCOR is looking at risk mitigation in terms of quantifying the risk mitigating impact of soil health practices as a way to scale and de-risk practice adoption. There is broad scientific consensus that soil health practices mitigate risk in agriculture. Yet, the institutions that price these risks, such as lenders and insurers, do not yet incorporate soil health practices into their risk pricing. And why is that? Well, LANCOR looked at this pretty extensively and found that lenders and insurers just simply lack the effective actuarially sound models to determine the risk mitigation benefits associated with specific soil health practices on any given piece of land. If we can demonstrate to lenders that they can reduce their financial risk by even 5 or 10%, that's a huge number that they would be saving. And then we think that lenders would really have a clear reason to invest in developing products and offerings that can incentivize soil health practice adoption for producers. If lenders and insurers have the empirical data to value soil, then healthy soil is valuable and can be incentivized. Products and offerings such as reduced rate loans, larger loans, more flexible terms, or lower crop insurance rates can de-risk a farmer's upfront investment in new practices. And I get really excited about this approach because while we will absolutely need a myriad of different approaches and incentives and rewards to help this form of agriculture take flight, I believe where we most immediately need to focus our efforts is in incentives that support a farmer during the first few years of a transition. Also, it's worth noting that economic incentives from finance and insurance don't have the social stigma of government or NGOs, and that can help overcome the cultural barriers to behavior change in practice adoption. Lastly, I'd like to point out that this is an approach of de-risking finances in contrast to where a lot of the oxygen is currently being used in the room, which is in soil carbon markets, which are an exciting future potential, but I think a lot of us understand that these are still nascent and largely theoretical and very dependent on precise measurement of soil carbon storage, which is still very much a work in progress at this stage. Now, LANCOR's approach to de-risking is to build a predictive, actuarially sound modeling tool. And we are doing this by convening a wonderful collaborative cross-sector working group to build this model. And you can find a little bit more about that team on our website. We are taking the approach of looking at specific soil health practices and using remote sensing and biophysical data on cover cropping, tillage, rotational diversity, and other practices, and compiling all of that to inform a statistical and economic model that predicts outcomes such as yield variability and recovery time, and putting all of that together to assign a risk score for a farm or ranch based on existing conditions and future management plans. Now, this is a wildly simplified explanation of that modeling methodology, but we are really excited to begin putting that together. We're looking to have a pilot and roll out at regional scale beginning in the US and the Midwest in the fall of 2021. Now, there are others who also have ways of thinking about financing and incentivizing of this work. And then finally, the opportunity as we see it is to invite new stakeholders to the table. We want to see lenders and insurers and investors also joining academics and scientists and producers and the brands that are increasingly rallying behind this movement for soil health. We want to see more traditional and conservative players in the space, as well as our wonderful pioneering early adopters. There's the opportunity to embrace risk mitigation as a way to address economic prosperity, food security, and environmental resilience. And then finally, an opportunity to use the data and learnings from risk mitigation work to make crucial policy changes to federal crop insurance and public lending, and really bring those stakeholders in lending and insurance to link arms with us at the policy table. So we are excited about that possibility. I will pass on the baton now, and thank you so much for your time.